design world orders, but they can hope to support them. So that's the second key qualification. Middle powers are by definition, countries that see themselves as having both an interest and a capacity and an identity associated with trying to stabilize world orders and enable them to adapt to changing shocks over time. So in that sense, not every country that has middle-ranking capacities is a middle power in behavioral terms. So as Robert Cox once said, middle powers are a role in search of an actor. And Korea, over the course of the period since the late 1980s, has come to play this kind of a role for on quite a consistent basis, in part because of its capacities, in part because of the neighborhood that it occupies and the challenges that you face. Now, in this slide, which is probably very hard for you to read, but the point about this is it's basically taken the first order sports mega events through the period of high neoliberalism from the mid-1980s to essentially right up to the early 2020s. And the point that I want to make is two, really. One, the bolded hosts are hosts that are conventionally understood as hosts that are from middle powers. And what I want to underscore is Korea is not alone. There were many other states that sought to take advantage of this opportunity, middle-ranking states that sought to take advantage of this opportunity to gain strategic advantages in the world, but also in so doing to help shape both the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup as or the FIFA as an institution, but also the world in which it was embedded. And even the countries that the events that are marked in blue are events that, as you inaugurated, are co-hosted events, but even each one of those events has at least one key middle power participant in the partnership that undertook those events. So this is a widespread practice. The other point that I want to make, and it's even harder to read, but if you look at the number of countries that bid to host these events, what you see over the course of this period is an arc. So you see at the beginning, when Korea won the right to host the 1988 Olympics, there was one other bidder. When Los Angeles won the right to host the Games in 1984, it was the only bidder. And so over time, as the success of these events built, you saw more and more countries that saw this as an attractive opportunity. So that at its peak, for the Athens Games in 2004, there were 11 cities that were bidders for the event. But then things start to deteriorate, and people start to lose the affection for these kinds of events, so that by the early 2020s, we're back to one bidder. The Los Angeles and Paris Games became the event holders in 2024 and 2028 because there were no other bidders. So what we see is an arc in the success and the impact of these events over the course of that period of time. So how did middle powers as a group, including Korea, seek to take advantage of this opportunity? And again, I want to say that there are two ways of looking at this. What they themselves sought to achieve and what their hosting roles meant for the arc of the event itself and the world order within which it was embedded. So I would say that, and this is not new, many of you have studied sports mega events, but essentially there are three broad categories of goals that most hosts seek to achieve. One is developmental. They see this as a kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take advantage of this monumental event to remake their urban landscape, to reposition themselves, to unlock funding for major infrastructural projects, to reposition themselves in terms of the global political economy. So there's that developmental role. Secondly, they seek to use this as an opportunity to accumulate what international relations scholars talk about as soft power, the power of attraction. Middle powers have, by definition, limited coercive capacity. But what they can gain is that they can gain power of attraction. They can have cultural achievements, they can have technological achievements, they can have intellectual achievements, they can have organizational achievements. Those make them attractive, and they enable them to do things in other domains. And Korea, I think, is a really good example of how this power of attraction has been utilized. And the third thing, and it's closely related to the second, is that they use these events to redefine or reframe their identities. A sport mega event is an opportunity to tell the world a new story about who you are. So in the case of South Africa, for example, South Africa has used its sport mega event hosting roles to announce that it was no longer a white minority ruled country, that it was a country that was committed to racial reconciliation. You had, of course, the case of Korea, which announced to the world that it was no longer a developing country. It had become an advanced country that had sophisticated capacities, and that was also able to join the advanced countries of the world. So they use themselves to reposition themselves, or use these events to reposition themselves in terms of identity. Now, if all goes well, then this is a good news story. And countries succeed in achieving these kinds of advantages. That, if it goes well, feeds into their capacity to perform other kinds of middle power roles. It allows them to engage in bridge building, in conciliation, in convening other countries, in organizing events. So it enables them to gain attractiveness as interlocutors, as mediators in world affairs. But we also know, and we also learned over time, that things don't always go well. There's often cost overruns, there are delays, there are failures in terms of commitments to remediate or to improve the natural environment. There can be human rights controversies associated with these kinds of events. And so over time, all countries came to think of these as pretty high risk and high stakes events. And there was a growing reluctance to pursue these events, hence that arc that you saw earlier, where countries went from scrambling to take advantage of this opportunity to running for the exits, to avoid being saddled with these kinds of events. And the second point that I wanted to make is the systemic consequences of these kinds of events. Essentially, what middle power hosting showed, first of all, was that mega events were for everyone. They weren't just for great powers. Smaller states could also take advantage of these opportunities and could gain leverage from it. And they also, in the sort of neoliberal spirit of the time, suggested that all good things go together. You can gain profile, you can gain political influence, you can liberalize your politics, and you can make a lot of money doing it. All of these good things can go together. And you also saw that there were narratives associated with particular games that fed into this story. So we've talked about Seoul quite a bit. Seoul underscored the importance of these events in overcoming underdevelopment, in bridging East and West, and it also, particularly importantly, highlighted the role of sports mega events in helping to generate political liberalization and democratization, so that Seoul became the exemplar of the idea that these kinds of events could actually help to move political systems towards more democratic forms of politics. Barcelona exemplified the universalization of sport and Olympism, but also the promise of urban renewal and the promise of reconciliation between the Catalonian and Spanish nations. Lillehammer and Sydney underscored, am I at time? Of 20 minutes? Okay, okay. Let me just, I've obviously misjudged my time. So let me just go right to the very end and say that all of these good things have now come into question. There's a question about whether sports mega events can perform the kinds of roles that were expected of them, and that growing friction is mirrored by what's going on in the world as a whole. We live in a world where there's a fraying of the consensus around liberal international values and growing friction between competing visions of how the world should be organized. And sports mega events are on the front line of that contestation. And it raises the question of how countries like Korea and other middle powers are going to navigate this new, much more difficult and uncertain world. And I want to leave you with 5 quick points about what needs to be thought about. First of all, sports politics and sports diplomacy is going to become much more complicated. And the people who participate in this kind of work will have to be much better prepared for the complexity of the politics involved. Secondly, sports middle powers and other hosts are going to have to get better at co-hosting. There's going to be more and more of the kinds of complex politics associated with mounting events jointly. Thirdly, they need to think about what it means to mount a truly ecologically sustainable mega event. This is a challenge that we're all confronting more and more acutely. The Olympics and other sports mega events have to change. These are not inherently very sustainable institutions. Thirdly, they need to think about how to navigate the complex and controversial divisions over human rights. I think that's my 4th point, actually. And finally, and more broadly, they need to think, and I'm quoting Chris Gaffney here, how sports mega events and international sports organizations can more effectively contribute to human solidarity, mutual understanding, and social justice. In other words, how can the Olympics and other sports mega events recapture the more idealistic possibilities associated with international sports events? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Please give him a round of applause for his remarkable, valuable talk. 데이비드 블랙 교수님은 세계